Guys, I have a confession to make. I didn't really enjoy playing Celeste all that much on my first playthrough. I've since come around to it, but I've been trying to figure out what exactly it is that I didn't like about it for a while now. It's a hard thing to explain because what I didn't enjoy about it is very subjective. There's not a lot of things that I can point to and say, look, this thing is bad. Let me get you up to speed on the off chance that this indie gem has slipped underneath your radar. The best way I can think to phrase it is this. Celeste is a collection of discrete, well-designed platforming challenges which runs adjacent to a story based in metaphors about life, anxiety, and other mental health disorders. Hopefully, if you've played the game, you'll at least agree with me on that. That is what the game is. Now right off the bat, I have to air out that I am not the biggest fan of 2D platformers in general. For some reason, most games in the genre just make me upset to play. Naturally, that raises the question, why would I even try to play Celeste, which is supposedly one of the hardest games in the genre? Well, there are a few reasons I decided to give it a shot, but the primary one was the death system. Levels in Celeste are made up of screens, each of which is ostensibly its own checkpoint. If you die on a certain screen, you only get sent back to the beginning of that screen, not back to the start of the level, and not back to a checkpoint in the middle of the level. There's also not a limit on how many times you can die. The only barrier to progress is the platforming challenge itself. As far as I'm concerned, this makes Celeste the most accessible 2D platformer that I've ever seen. I think I've proven this single-handedly because I'm kind of a Luddite when it comes to these games, and even I was able to beat the Farewell level, which is supposedly the hardest content in the game. By extension, that makes Celeste very easy to recommend, but there are a few caveats that I should mention before you go trying this if you're not very familiar with 2D platformers. The first and most important one is this. You have to beat Celeste, as in you have to go into the game with a bit of a chip on your shoulder. There are a lot of interesting ramifications to using the phrase beat a game as if it's a competition between you and the game to see if you can get to the end, but I'm not sure how many people actually use that phraseology or even less think about it that way, so it's just an interesting thing to note on the side. What I'm getting at is that the game heavily relies on the players to motivate themselves to jump through the hoops that are set before them. Now granted, they are some pretty fun hoops to jump through, but one, fun is subjective, and two, at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of arbitrary hurdles that you literally have to jump over for basically no reason at all. Now some people might find reason in connecting with the story and wanting to see how it unfolds or how it ends. Other people might find reason in that they won't feel like a capital T true capital G gamer unless they jump through all the correct hoops. Now obviously that second reason is a little bit reductive, but I truly believe that there are some people out there who will play a game solely for the purpose of being able to say that they beat it. I myself have been guilty of this mindset with games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls, but the difference here is that with those games I felt motivated to improve myself and get better, whereas with Celeste I can't exactly say the same. Now obviously because of the extremely tight level design, improving your platforming chops is a necessary requirement to complete the game. But because of the fact that you have infinite lives and also every now and then the controller will just glitch out, I never felt the need to really get consistent at anything. Okay, listen up, because this is probably the only real, legitimate criticism that I have of this game that isn't based in feeling or my previous experiences. I played this game on the Nintendo Switch with a Pro controller. Now, I don't know if this glitch also happens on other controllers. I've heard that it does, but I'm not sure. Okay, so in Celeste, you can use this dash move, and you can point it in any of the 8 cardinal or ordinal directions. If you're playing on a controller, every now and then you'll encounter something called a false diagonal. What happens is, take for example, you want to dash to the east. The game will decide, no, actually you want to dash to the northeast. Now, I'm not exactly sure how often this occurs, I'm not sure what the percentage is, but when I was playing, it felt somewhere like 1 in every 20 or 1 in every 25 times that I would try to dash a certain way, the game would decide that I actually wanted to dash in a different direction. Much has been said about difficult games needing to be fair, and the idea that if you die in a truly well-designed difficult game, then you understand that it's you who made the mistake, and it's your fault that you died and not the game's fault. This sort of controller input malfunction is poison to the experience, especially on the extra levels and the more difficult challenges outside of the main story. I wouldn't say it's necessarily that big of a problem if you're just going to do the main content of the game, but it definitely is something to be aware of, especially if you have a bit more of a competitive mindset when it comes to games like these. The other thing that I had mentioned earlier as a barrier to my motivation was the fact that you have infinite lives. By no means am I saying that having infinite lives is a bad thing, I just wish that they could have handled it a little bit better. And I don't think that we can go any further without discussing the story a little bit, so from here on out, we've got some spoilers. It's nothing crazy, but I do suggest that you go into this game blind and experience it yourself first. The video will still be here when you're done. I will say that the plot itself brought me to tears several times, but before I give it the "it made me cry" seal of approval, there are a few things we need to talk about. Generally, stories in 2D platformers are very simple. You know, Bowser kidnaps Peach, King K. Rool's a dickhead, Sonic the Hedgehog. Compared to this, Celeste is a lot more ambitious in its topics and themes that it chooses to discuss. Life, anxiety, depression, finding inner harmony, all of these things are very complex. They're great themes for building a story, but are they well mixed enough with the gameplay? After all, the intersection between storytelling and interactivity is what makes video games as an artistic medium extremely compelling to me. If you approach the game the way that Madeline approaches the mountain, then you might be inclined to say yes, but if you don't, then the game kind of just leaves you out to dry. Even if you do, you have to admit that the plot very rarely affects the gameplay outside of climbing the mountain just for climbing the mountain's sake. The couple of times that it does are the quote-unquote boss fights, which in my opinion are the worst parts of the game. One of the boss fights is with Madeline, who is part of Madeline and is, I suppose, a manifestation of Madeline's inner self. Throughout the main game, she's constantly berating Madeline and telling her that she can't possibly make it to the top of the mountain, she's not a mountain climber, she can't do this. So it's very confusing to me that when they have their big showdown at the bottom of the mountain, Madeline doesn't say anything to Madeline in the course of their fight. I'm not talking about adding more cutscenes, I'm talking about adding more interactions between the two during the gameplay. The game has already shown that it's willing to do something similar to this when you're carrying Theo out of the Mirror Temple in his little crystal. If you use him to open up one of the gates, he has a little comment about how he's being useful even though he's trapped in a crystal. It's not very substantive and it is optional, but I think it's a great idea and it could have been particularly effective during the battle and boss fight. Editor's note, this actually does happen during the battle and boss fight, so I was wrong on that, but I think the whole point of what I was trying to say is that it could be a little bit more forceful. In its current state, it's just not impactful enough, and it feels like a shadow of the Theo interaction, which was already a bit minimal. After all, it's not Madeline's physicality that has Madeline scared, it's that she's constantly reminding her that she's ill-equipped for the situations that she finds herself in. Madeline recognizes when Madeline is struggling and is there to tell her that she can't handle it. I wish that the game had done the same for the player. There is only one instance where the game recognizes that you have died multiple times on a level and triggers a cutscene because of it. It happens at the very last screen of the very last level. After you die around 5 or 6 times, Madeline will come and ask you if you're alright for a second. Now, it's very bare bones, but I think this idea could have been fleshed out so much more. Imagine if during the battle and boss fight, she stopped everything just to remind you how many times you've died and to tell you that you're never going to make it to the top. This could have been the best way to merge story and gameplay in a way that's rewarding for both sides, since if you're good at the game, then you won't even have to see that cutscene anyway. This also goes back to my comment about infinite lives from earlier. When you make a game with an infinite number of lives and you also have a checkpoint in every single room, you're kind of eliminating all of the usual suspects for creating long-term tension in a video game. They compensate for this in the gameplay by making the platforming challenges themselves extremely tight and pretty difficult. Purely as a game, this design is flawless, and I consider both the infinite lives and the screen-based checkpoint system to be this game's unique selling points. So it's a shame that the narrative of this game almost never uses those two assets to its advantage. Again, the one exception to this is that little interaction with Madeline at the end of the farewell level. Is this one flaw enough to condemn the entire narrative as a failure? Absolutely not. As I've already said, this game brought me to tears multiple times, and I consider this story to be one of the most beautiful that I have ever had the pleasure of experiencing in a video game. I would compare this to performing or competing at a very high level. When something is very, very close to being perfect, even the slightest imperfection or oversight gets magnified because of how well everything else is executed around it. That makes the controller issue a bit harder to swallow, but I am readily prepared to blame Nintendo for that one if I get some hard evidence that it doesn't happen on PlayStation or Xbox. Anyway, adding those cutscenes that would only happen if you died a certain number of times would help to fill the void that's left by having infinite lives and making a checkpoint in every single room. The biggest portion of this game that suffers from a lack of long-term tension is the main story, or the parts of the game that deal with Madeline summiting the mountain. The extra challenges, like gathering the strawberries and doing the B-sides, were far more palatable to me because I knew going into them that they were going to be optional side content. The farewell level also fared a lot better than the main content because its theme of overcoming death and loss jived a lot more with the relentless cycle of death and platforming that the game provides. The only bit of side content that I didn't enjoy as much as the main game was the 8-bit version of the game, which is kind of ironic because without that, this game wouldn't exist. Given that Celeste was funded as a roided up version of that 8-bit game, it's no surprise that the developers focused more on the mechanical aspects of it, since that's the only part of the game that audiences were guaranteed to like. And that's fine, that gives the game a good strong foundation to stand on, but I'd be lying if I said that it didn't feel a bit tedious to me. As a result, I spent most of the minute-to-minute gameplay in a state of indifference, or at worst, annoyance. If you wanted to see what that looked like firsthand, there's about 10 hours of VODs on my second channel, where a majority of the time I'm just sitting in silence getting through the levels. You know what, I think I just figured out an answer to the question that I posed myself at the beginning of this video. But I've been trying to figure out what exactly it is that I didn't like about it for a while now. Given my absolute disinterest in the 8-bit version of this game, it's kind of a miracle that I found anything enjoyable about the main game of Celeste at all. I feel compelled to explain my disinterest because this might become a point of contention among people who enjoyed this game. Just for now, let's ignore all of the circumstances surrounding this game's creation and any sort of developer intent that might be floating around out there. Pico 8 represents just the mechanical version of Celeste. It's only platforming, nothing else. So you know how there are stages of grief, right? Well, there are also stages of platforming. Did you know that? Oh, you didn't? Well, that's because I just made them up right now. Evaluation, experimentation, execution. This wouldn't be a proper TCG video if I didn't break something up into groups now, wouldn't it? If you have a fast enough reaction time, then all three of these stages can happen pretty much instantaneously. But for most of the levels in Celeste, these stages are pretty clearly defined. Evaluation is when you go into a stage and you attempt to figure out what's required of you to complete it. This stage happens only in your mind. Evaluation can happen before your character even leaves the ground. It can also happen in the middle of a platforming challenge while you're looking ahead to see what's coming next. The experimentation stage starts the first time that you physically attempt to complete the platforming challenge. In the case of Celeste, you might not know exactly what the end of the room is going to look like, but you're going to need to give it a few shots before you figure out what the game wants you to do. That figuring it out, the aha moment, is the turning point in between the experimentation and execution stages. Execution is purely physical. At this point, you're fully aware of what's required of you in order to complete the platforming challenge. The only thing that remains is inputting the correct commands in order to complete it properly. Admittedly, this is more of an analysis of my own process of completing a platforming challenge, but at least now we have some common vocabulary. Evaluation and experimentation are the two stages where I enjoy myself the most. I think it's really fun to figure out what exactly is necessary to complete a level. What I don't find fun and what is not an enjoyable experience for me is when I get stuck on the execution phase. It could be because I let the misinputs get under my skin. It could be because the controller malfunctions also get under my skin. It could be because my fingers aren't physically used to inputting so many commands so close together. I've run into problems with that with games like Smash before. Whatever the reason is, when I get stuck on the execution phase, the sensation that I feel can only be described as bashing my head against a brick wall. This causes me such intense mental and physical anguish that I've had to stop myself on multiple occasions before I've harmed myself or damaged the controller that I've been using. This might have something to do with internalized toxic masculinity. I better write that down for later. I'm tempted to write these off as my own self-destructive tendencies manifesting themselves in a video game, but even the people that I've talked to who are ride or die for 2D platformers have told me that when they get too serious about one, they experience something akin to self-torture. All of this is to say, really, that even though this game gave me some very positive experiences with the narrative, especially in the farewell level, I have also experienced very negative things while playing this game, and I feel like I would be dishonest if I didn't try and say that and try and explain why. Do you see why I said there are some caveats before I can recommend this game? All of this is made even more confusing because I'm not even really that confident in my own taste in video games yet. I was hoping that in the course of writing this review, my feelings about this game would become more apparent, but I still feel as conflicted as ever. It feels like this game has helped me reach enlightenment, and yet at the same time it's also brought out the worst in me. All personal inconsistencies aside, this is a fantastic game, and even though I have some qualms with the main story, I think it's well worth the time and money just for that alone. The game, like any other, has some imperfections, and I do have to factor in that a majority of the time that I was playing, I wasn't exactly, enjoying myself. However, I do have to respect just how much love and beautiful sincerity was put into this game. Go and play Celeste. You're not going to regret it. Oh yeah, also trans rights.